And thank you so much to all of you for inviting us. I'm Jan Garrett. I'm the program manager at the Pacific ADA Center. And today we're going to talk about service and emotional support animals in emergency shelters. So next slide, please. So I am part of the Pacific ADA Center, as I said, and that we are part of the ADA National Network. And there is a map on the screen that is showing 10 regions. So the ADA National Network is broken down into 10 regional ADA centers. We are Region 9 in the green states. We serve Arizona, Nevada, California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Basin territories. So we are a big region, and I know we serve more than the Red Cross. I don't know what you call yourselves, but affiliates that are on this call. But we hope to be able to connect to other Red Crosses as well throughout our region. This is kind of the 800 number where you can call any of the regional ADA centers, depending on what area code you're calling from, that 1-800-949-4232. And then adata.org is the website for the ADA National Network. So we encourage you to explore that site as well. Next slide. And then this is our contact information at the Pacific ADA Center, same 800 number, 949-4232. And ADA Tech, ADATECH at adapacific.org is our email. And then adapacific.org is our website. And I very much encourage you to explore our website and our materials. I think they can be very helpful to you. So actually, before we get into the overview of the ADA, let me just explain that if any of you contact us either through our phone or our email, your contact is confidential, your contact is free to us, and we do not do enforcement, so we don't report anyone to any of the enforcing agencies. We are really just there to provide information on the Americans with Disabilities Act and the other laws. So you can feel free to contact us without worry. And we answer the phone between 8 and 5 if you call us, and you can email us, and we typically respond to emails within a maximum of 48 hours. So we look forward to hearing from you. So the overview of the ADA is where we'll start today. So the ADA is a civil rights law, and it does have 5 titles. Title I is employment. Title II is state and local government agencies. Title III is public accommodations and commercial facilities. Title IV is telecommunications, and Title V is miscellaneous. I will say that today, when we're talking about emergency shelters, typically those are covered by a combination of Title II and Title III, since most emergency shelters are actually started and kind of set up by the local jurisdiction, but then the Red Cross will often operate the shelter, and Red Cross is considered an entity that's covered by Title III. You're a public accommodation. So it's a kind of a combination of Titles 2 and 3 today that we'll be talking about. Next slide. So let's have some basic knowledge about service and emotional support animals. Next slide. So the ADA requirements in both Title II and Title III say the same basic thing about service animals, and that's what we'll cover here. Next slide. So service animals are covered under the ADA concept of modification of policy. And that is that most state and local government and privately owned facilities have a no pet policy. Generally, you don't allow pets in your buildings and facilities. However, when you are a government agency or a public accommodation that operates a private facility that's open to the public, you have to allow service animals as a modification of your no pet policy. Next slide. So service animals and emotional support animals can also be considered reasonable accommodations on the job. And I know we're really not talking about employment here, but generally only if the animal performs tasks that the employer cannot otherwise perform for the person. Next slide. So service animal access is important, and that is where individuals with disabilities come into the shelter and are allowed to be accompanied by their service animals. They need to be able to go in all areas of the shelter where members of the public or people that are being sheltered are allowed to go. And so their animal gets to go with them to all those places, including all the goods, services, programs, or activities that are offered. Next slide. The definition of a service animal changed somewhat in 2011 when the U.S. Department of Justice changed the regulations. And a service animal now means any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including a physical, intellectual, or other mental disability. And as we will talk about in a moment more, companionship of the animal does not constitute a work or task. It has to actually be trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of that individual. And this is the U.S. Department of Justice definition, and it differs a little bit from the FEMA definition of service animal, but basically it's the same. Next slide. So a miniature horse could also have to be allowed in a shelter. It is not a dog, but if it is reasonable as a modification to allow the miniature horse in the shelter, then you have to allow it. And you can, look at how big it is. Typically, it's the size of a large dog. It also has to be under control of the handler, just like a service animal does. It has to be housebroken. And it has to meet all the size and safety requirements of the facility. Next slide. So what does work or task mean? The work has to be directly related to the individual's disability. And the work of the animal does not, the work of the animal does need to be physical. So the animal has to do a physical task, but the disability of the handler does not have to be physical. So it may be responding to brain-based impairments that the handler has, like psychiatric disabilities. It may be able to detect distress in someone who has anxiety. Those are all examples of what service animals can do, but the animal itself has to do a physical task. Next slide. So what might that mean for somebody with a physical disability? The work or task of the animal could be navigation for somebody who's blind or low vision. It could alert someone who is deaf or hard of hearing to other people or sounds. It can retrieve items like medicine or water or a phone for someone. It could provide support and assistance with balance and stability for the handler. And it also, among other things, might provide assistance during a seizure. It might stay with the handler during the seizure, make sure the handler gets through the seizure okay, and kind of protect them from people interfering while they're having the seizure, and then just making sure the person is okay afterward. Next slide. Also, physical tasks can include chest compressions for CPR. There are dogs that have been trained to do CPR, chest compressions, on somebody who might have a heart condition. So that's another example of a physical task that an animal can be trained to do. And these pictures show an animal doing chest compressions, and then the second one shows them leaning down to hear whether or not they're hearing breath coming from their handler, and whether or not they need to continue with the chest compressions. Next slide. So for somebody who has a psychological or emotional disability, examples of work or tasks that the animal might do would be to prevent or interrupt impulsive or destructive behavior by their handler, like if they were, pinching themselves or even cutting themselves or doing something destructive to themselves, the animal could interrupt that behavior, or if they were just becoming really anxious. And they can help also an individual that has dissociative identity disorder to remain grounded. And this could be through many different things like nudging their hand, licking their hand, pulling their handler over to sit down on a seat or a bench. Those are all examples of physical tasks that an animal could do to interrupt anxiety or other impulsive behavior. Next slide. So as we discussed earlier, companionship or comfort is not considered work or a task for a service animal. So the provision of emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship without more does not constitute work or tasks for the purpose of the definition of a service animal. The ability to soothe is not work. Next slide. So although they are not covered by the ADA, emotional support animals, or ESAs, as they will be referred to here, do typically provide comfort and emotional support. That is not a task, so they are not covered by the ADA, but they can provide valuable support for people with certain types of disabilities. And ESAs can be almost any type of animal. Remember when we talked earlier about service animals are only dogs or miniature horses, but ESAs can be cats, rodents, they can be birds, they can be a lot of different kinds of animals, usually excluding exotic animals like large birds or reptiles. Next slide. So individuals who have service animals and emotional support animals are not exempt from the local animal control or public health requirements. That means that you can require that service animals and emotional support animals are vaccinated and that they have a tag from like the county or the city that shows that they have been vaccinated and that they're licensed. But the tag does not, cannot be required to show that it is a service animal. Next slide. So what proof is required for service animals? They're not required to wear a special collar, harness, or tag, and they're not required to have papers or a certificate regarding their training. So it's there's no actual physical proof that is required for a service animal. Next slide. So you can ask 2 questions of the handler of the animal to determine if it actually is a service animal. Is this a service animal required because of a disability is the first question. Presumably they answer yes. It is a service animal required because of a disability. And the second question is, what specific task or work has the animal been trained to perform? You can ask that, and the handler should be able to tell you what the task or work is that the animal has been trained to perform for them. If they cannot tell you that, then it may not indeed be a service animal. Now, you should not inquire any more about the nature of the disability of the handler. Just asking, is this a service animal required because of a disability? And then what task or work has the animal been trained to perform? You also should not ask to see the task performed because it may not be time to do the task. It may be a seizure sensing dog, and it may be that the person is not having a seizure, so the animal will not react as it does when the person has a seizure. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So control, this is really important. So Remember that only service animals are allowed under the ADA, which means only service animals are allowed in emergency shelters. That means that it's supposed to be an animal that is trained. It's supposed to be trained and housebroken and under the control of its handler at all times. Part of being under control means the handler needs to have the animal on a leash or tether or harness, unless that leash or tether interferes with the animal doing its task. In that case, the animal needs to be under the strict voice control of the handler. And the handler needs to be able to get the animal to come to them and be under control just by giving them verbal or hand signals. Next slide. So the conduct of a service animal is really, really important. Being under control means that the animal is not growling or barking or trying to bite someone. And if the animal is out of control, and the handler cannot get it under control, they probably get one chance to actually get the animal under control. Not if it bites someone, but if it barks or if it has an accident on the floor, they might get one chance to get that animal under control. And if they cannot, then you can exclude the animal from the shelter. Of course, if you do that, you need to be able to arrange for where the animal is going to be sheltered if it cannot be with the handler in the emergency shelter. And you should think really hard about whether or not it is appropriate to separate that service animal from its handler, and whether or not you really need to do that because the animal is out of control and could pose a danger to other people within the shelter. Next slide. So with legitimate service animals, you really should be hardly aware that they are present at all. Like this picture is showing, they really should just be lying on the floor next to their handler or doing the task for the handler, and you really should be hardly aware that they are present at all as a service animal. Next slide. So in an emergency, if you have to exclude a service animal, where can the animal be placed? You're going to want to limit exclusion of the animal to times when the animal's behavior actually poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, like I was talking about earlier. And a direct threat under the ADA has to be based on a substantial risk of actual harm and not on a potential risk of harm and not on generalizations. So you can't just look at an animal and say, oh, that's a Doberman. And so Dobermans tend to be out of control and tend to be mean dogs. And so that animal is going to pose a risk to other people at the shelter. You cannot just make generalizations about what an animal is doing or what it will do. You have to base exclusion of the animal from a shelter on actual direct threat, which is a substantial risk of actual harm. Next slide. You also cannot charge fees, or what the ADA refers to as surcharges, to individuals with disabilities. For example, an unequal cleaning fee or any other fee to an individual with a disability as a condition to allowing the service animals to accompany them. So it's important to know that you cannot charge a fee for like cleaning up dog hair or that kind of thing. If the animal has an accident, if the handler is able to clean that up, they should clean that up themselves, and they should be taking the animal out regularly to be able to do its business outside. You should not really have to have staff cleaning up after an animal unless there's just no way the handler can do that at the shelter. Next slide. So it's important to keep in mind that service animals are working animals. Do not pet, feed, or speak to a service animal. Because if you feed the animal a treat, if you pet them, if you talk to them, it could be that they think their work time is over and they won't actually be responding to their handler's commands to do work anymore. So it's really important that you not interact with the animal because it is a working animal. Next slide. It's important to know that there's technically no limit on the number of animals that somebody can have as service animals. It needs to be a reasonable number. But for example, you could have 2 service dogs because they both help you balance and they're both approximately the same size. So you hold on to their leashes or harnesses and that helps you be able to balance. So it could be that more than one service animal is allowed, but the handler needs to be able to say what each animal does and why there is more than one. And it needs to definitely be a reasonable number of service animal. So that's important to understand. Next slide. As I described earlier, you cannot really assume that because a certain dog breed might typically be a difficult to deal with dog breed or a dog breed that barks or is more usually a defense dog, you cannot really base your opinion about a service animal on what the breed of dog is. Any breed can be used as a service animal. The key is the animal's behavior, how the animal actually behaves when it is in the shelter setting. Service animals in training are not actually covered by the ADA. The ADA doesn't talk about service animals in training, but state laws typically do. And in California, we do have a law that talks about service animals in training. And there are people who are allowed, trainers who are allowed to take animals out and socialize them in public and train them in public. And so they are allowed to train service animals. But the ADA doesn't really even speak to service animals in training. So a service animal in training would not typically be an animal that would be allowed in a shelter. Typically, it would need to be a service animal that's already been trained to do work or a task. Service animals in training are in the community when there is not a disaster and they are being trained and being socialized by their trainer. Next slide. Other animals, other than dogs and miniature horses, may be allowed in non-emergency shelters. So homeless shelters, those types of shelters, because the Fair Housing Act applies to those types of shelters, and the Fair Housing Act allows emotional support animals. And as I described earlier, emotional support animals can be many different kinds of animals. They can be cats, they can be birds, they can be rodents, they can be all kinds of different animals. The ADA only speaks to service animals, which are dogs and miniature horses. So other animals may be allowed in non-emergency shelters, but emergency shelters really only have to allow service animals that are dogs or miniature horses that can do one or more tasks. Next slide. So there are a couple of defenses regarding service animals. In other words, that a shelter could say, we can't really have the service animal. One is if a service animal fundamentally alters the nature of the services provided. Now, that's likely not going to take place at an emergency shelter, but it could be at a zoo or like some sort of animal shelter where a dog might disturb the other animals. And in that case, you could say, well, this service animal has to wait out here in the shade with some water in a kennel while their handler goes through the zoo so that they don't disturb the other animals. So that's where you can have a fundamental alteration of how a zoo operates and not allow a service animal in. Also, like we talked about before, the service animal could pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others. But if you can reduce that direct threat somehow by making a reasonable modification, in other words, by maybe helping that person with the service animal stay in a different part of the shelter if you feel like the animal is going to be a direct threat, if someone fears animals or if someone is allergic to dogs, you can try to separate that person with their service animal from the other shelter residents. And that's a reasonable modification you may have to make when actually dealing with service animals and how they might impact other people at the shelter. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about some best practices for service and emotional support animals. Train your shelter staff just like you're doing today. This is a great example of training and being able to understand what's a service animal, what's an emotional support animal, what's allowed, what does under control mean, not talking to or feeding the animal. So training the shelter staff on the basic rules that we've been talking about here today, and the location of animal shelters that could care for emotional support animals and pets if someone needs that during a disaster. It's really, really important to be able to know where those other animal shelters are during a disaster so that people could take their emotional support animals there and their pets there if they need to, and just keep their service animal with them at the shelter. Next slide. Creating space for service animals. So within shelters, create a space where people who bring their service animals can have them next to them. So you might want to put their cot in an area where you can make some good space around it for the animal to have its blanket or its bed there, and be able to stay with its handler in the shelter. You're also going to want to make space, in the area where you have meals for the animal to be with its handler in the meal area. And so you're going to want to make sure that you're making room and that you have aisleways big enough for people to get down the aisleways, even if you have a service animal and its gear with its handler. And if, as I was explaining earlier, if another shelter resident is afraid of dogs or has dog allergies, try to separate them at different parts of the shelter so that both can use the shelter and be there without too much stress. Next slide. It's also important to have service animal relief areas. This could be just a grassy area outside the shelter that shelter staff need to identify when they set up the shelter, so that the animal can relieve itself outside and have no problem doing that. So that grassy area should be pretty close to where the shelter's entry or exit is, so that it's easy for that handler to take the animal outside to do its business. Next slide. The care and supervision of service animals is important to understand. The staff of the shelter are not responsible for the care and supervision of service animals. It's the handler who is responsible for the care and supervision of their animal. They're responsible for giving it food and water and making sure it's not too stressed, making sure they take it out to use the bathroom. And if somebody is at the shelter and cannot independently be able to care for their service animal, you may want to see if you can find any volunteers or locate a friend or a family member who could come to the shelter to help that person with a disability to care for their service animal. Because it could be that that person, that handler, normally has a personal care attendant that helps them care for the animal. And if that personal care attendant is not with them in the shelter during the disaster, it may be that they need some extra help to do that. So finding a volunteer, finding a friend or a family member of that handler could be important if they need that assistance. And then emergency pet shelters, as we talked about, are set up in a disaster and should be able to care for emotional support animals as well as pets. Next slide. This is an emergency kit for animals is something we tell handlers to make sure that they are providing themselves so that they can carry supplies in go bags for their animals. They should have food and water, medication that the animal might take, bowls for food and water, the ID tags and the veterinary records in case those are needed, pet shampoo, wipes, small bags, and other items that are used to clean up after the animal, a blanket or their bed that can roll up for sleeping, and maybe a favorite toy or two for the animal so that it can kind of lower its stress level, and also a leash or harness. So this is something that you could encourage their handlers to have. And if you do training of people in the community, making sure that they're having an emergency kit for their animals, their service animals, before they come to the emergency shelter. Next slide. And then these are just some resources that I have provided. Pacific ADA Center has an emergency preparedness page that's got lots of publications and resources. And then the ADA National Network that we are a part of has a service animal resource hub that you can look at. And there's also a specific section in the resource hub around emergencies. So you might want to go to that link and you might find that helpful. Next slide. Then the ADA National Network Service Animal Resource Hub also has just the general resource hub that is available. And the U.S. Department of Justice has a service animal frequently asked questions document that answers a lot of general questions about service animals and being under control and where service animals are allowed, etc. So that's a helpful document to review. Next slide. So good. So I think that's really the slides that we have. So I want to make sure that people have a chance to ask your questions, because there's usually a lot of questions about service animals and you know, any other resources that the Pacific ADA Center can provide to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Really, really, really great info. Everyone, I've unmuted your mic. You are able to raise your hand or unmute yourself to speak. Jen, I don't know if you can see, we see a lot of claps and a round of applause on the chat.
Thank you.
So Alex mentioned that she did find on RC on the exchange, our exchange for the concordance for the operating a shelter to welcome service animals. Boo, you had your hand up. You want to come off mute?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had my hand up, but I guess I kind of do have a question. Thank you. If the people that are in the shelter, the clients of the shelter, have a pet with them, if the shelter allows the pet, what's your best suggestions on the best way to manage that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it depends on what the shelter's policies are about whether they allow pets. Remember, pets are typically not trained. So there might be issues with having an untrained animal, in the shelter. So I think you should think carefully as a shelter operator about whether you allow pets, and then making sure that you're separating people with pets maybe from other people, making sure that there's not bad interactions between pets and other shelter residents, even children who might be in the shelter. So there's definitely some best practices if the pets are allowed in making sure that everyone in the shelter is safe, and that the pet is safe as well, from anyone bothering the pet. But I would say that the best practice is usually to allow service animals in emergency shelters.
Thank you. Debbie, I saw your hand up earlier, but now it's down. Did you have a question?
Actually, you'd kind of answered the question that I'd had, and I had another one. What if a facility does not want a service animal in there?
And it actually is a service animal?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you don't really have a choice.
Right.
If it's a service animal and it's under control, and the person can answer the two questions that we went over, and it's doing a task for the person, then they really do have to allow it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. That's what I thought the answer was going to be. I just wanted to verify it. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Jan, I do have a follow-up question. So, we all know that they have to allow it. And what happens? I mean, what resources do we have if they don't allow it? Can we do something about it, or what other resources can we use?
If the shelter doesn't allow it, and when you say what other resources can we use, is this the Red Cross staff saying they're not going to allow it, or who is saying they don't allow it?
The facility, let's say. So this is a Red Cross managed shelter, and the definition of Red Cross managed shelter is the staff, the personnel is Red Cross, but then it's the partner agencies building. So let's say, city A or city X, it's their facility, and we come into play, and the city staff says they don't allow service animals. And what can we do on the Red Cross side or on anyone's side?
Yeah, well, I mean, the city is also covered by the ADA under Title II, and so they have to allow service animals just like a public accommodation, just like Red Cross would have to. I mean, I would say you need to talk to someone else at the city. I mean, hopefully you can talk to the ADA coordinator, someone at that city who knows the ADA, because if you're able to speak to someone who knows the ADA, they will know that they do have to allow it if it's a legitimate service animal.
Got it. Thank you. Eileen, you have your hand up?
Yes. I just wanted to clarify that the ADA is enforced for the sheltering, but not enforced for an evacuation center, correct?
An evacuation center, this is before the, yeah, if it's an evacuation center that's like operated by Red Cross, but again, is a city operated, city owned facility. Is that what you mean?
No, I just mean in general.
So
you don't have to make sure that they're ADA, correct? Because it's an evacuation center, so there'll be everybody there with all types of pets, correct?
Well, that's possibly true. If an evacuation center allows all kinds of animals, because that's just kind of, they're bringing in everybody and all the animals that they found when they've done an evacuation, then yes, it could be more than just service animals. ADA still applies there, but because it's temporary, then they would probably be allowing pets and emotional support animals and service animals at that particular evacuation site. And then they probably then need to determine, where do they shelter those pets? Where do they shelter those emotional support animals?
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
Because cities and counties should have a plan for where they shelter animals, as well as letting service animals be with their handlers. Are there other questions?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
Do you see hands? I'm going to go to the chat first. So Heidi is asking as if a client asks us to take their service dog out to relief, maybe they're not feeling well or something else, should we refrain from doing that, or is it okay in some circumstances?
Well, I really think it depends on the circumstances. Generally, I mean, I will tell you that the ADA does not require you to do it. The ADA says that the handler is responsible for the care and supervision of their animal. And if they're not able to do it, typically, they need to help you, maybe work with you to arrange for some other person, some other, friend or family member, or if the shelter has volunteers that are willing to do it, and are available to do it, then you can work on that, and you can decide whether or not you have that person. But as the shelter, you are not actually required to do that care, even if it's just taking the animal out to use the bathroom. You're not required to do that. And so I think it certainly would be, if you had to do it, I think you definitely want to be clear on, what do you do when you take them out? Is there a specific command that you give them to use the bathroom, making sure that they are, securely on their leash, all of those things. But technically the ADA says you are not required to do any care or supervision for that animal.
Thank you. And the next question is probably a very common question that we all have, is that how come there are no special tags for service animal, given their legal status is always the issue?
Well, because the Department of Justice, when they wrote the ADA regulations, they wanted to make it so that people could train their own service animals. And one of the reasons for that is that the organizations that train service animals, like canine companions, guide dogs for the blind, I will tell you that usually guide dogs are trained by Guide Dogs for the Blind or a specific guide dog organization, because it's a lot more intense training for a guide dog. Other service animals, however, may not be trained by a professional training agency, and the person themselves can train the animal to do the task and can train the animal to be under control. And because those agencies often have long waiting lists and are expensive, to train animals, the Department of Justice wanted individuals with disabilities to be able to train their own animals. And so they don't then have the ability to get a service animal tag or a certificate or anything if they've trained their own animal. So that's the primary reason.
Good to know. Thank you. And we'll go to several more questions and then we'll go to Michael next. So we have a question. Are we able to donate our own resources for shelter kit for pets? If that's the shelter itself, or if the owner is not providing the stuff for the pets or for the service animals.
Well, I don't think there's anything that prohibits you from doing that. I would think that the handler would want to provide their own food and things for the service animal, but it could be that they were evacuated too quickly, and maybe they didn't have a to-go bag, and so maybe helping the person be able to get the food, get the bowls, get the leash, that they need, would be a real service that the shelter staff could provide. Are you really required to do it? No, but nobody wants to see an animal go without food and water. And so, it may be that you're going to have to get some sort of other assistance, from the city or county, or from other volunteers, to be able to get some food and water, at least for the service animal.
Right. And also that, for us, for Red Cross, we do have resources. We're able to, to have animal control to come in and to have shelters to come in. We also can use our P card, our purchase card, to purchase all the food for pets and for service animals. We'll also be able to use our MCPC card, Mass Care Procurement Card, to purchase stuff that is needed for service animals. And we can also, like Mike said, that we're also able to submit a resource request 6409 for the stuff that we all need. Okay, let's go to Mike. Michael, you can come off mute.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. If we have an MOU with a church and they don't want animals in there, do they fall under Title II also?
Churches actually would fall under Title III when they're open to the public for a shelter.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so they would have to allow that. And I would assume in the MOU, you might want to check it, but I would think that you would say that you have to follow all, federal and state requirements, and that, ADA would be kind of part of that.
Thank you. And we have a suggestion from William. William says suggestions on balancing service animals with shelter clients that may be afraid of animals. Keep in mind, the new guidance says we do not segregate clients with disabilities from the general shelter population. So we have multiple, this was addressed earlier, but I think we still have this question of, we know that from this presentation, from previous presentations, we know that legally we're not allowed to not have the service animal on site. So I think this is more towards of what happens if the person or the city or whomever the other side does not know this law or does not know the legal complication of this. What can we do? If this is a 4-day weekend, no one can talk to them and no law enforcement can come in, or no animal services or shelters can come in, what can we do?
Okay. Well, first, let me go back to that other part of your question. You're right. You cannot segregate individuals with disabilities, but you can try to separate people who might have a fear of dogs or an allergy to dogs from, the person with the disability in the shelter, just kind of moving people around to different parts of the shelter. But in the case that you're talking about, Eway, are you talking about where the facility is not allowing the animal in?
Right. So we actually have a example in the chat right now. Shirley is saying that they were housing clients in Native American owned casino, Great Hall at Clear Lake 1 year, and they refused to house animals of any kind in their facilities, regardless if it's a service animal or just regular pets.
Okay. Well, a casino that's open to the public is covered under Title III of the ADA. Now, if they just refuse, I mean, I don't, do you all have training about, is there any other facility that you could move someone to? Do you know what the closest other facility might be that you could transport someone to that would have a service animal? And then, you would have to deal with the casino after the 4-day weekend. It might mean moving that person with a disability to another shelter temporarily.
Got it. So basically, let's say a facility, whether it's casino or whatnot, if they refuses and they just purely refuses, the only option that we have is probably just to relocate the clients, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I assume that's something that you all could potentially do with your resources, is relocate the client to the closest other shelter.
Correct. We do have the resources. We just want to know. I mean, we might not have the resources at that particular time, but we will have resources. We just want to know what can we do on our end if a situation arises with a partner. Okay, so
but they definitely, casinos are covered, just so you know, because they're open to the public.
Right. Okay, so Alex had a good comment. Blankets of Love is a wonderful Los Angeles County-based organization that provides pet food and supplies to the shelters. And what we usually do as well is if we open a shelter and we have blankets, we donate to Blankets of Operation of Love for them for the used blankets. Okay, Jamshed, you're next for your, you can unmute.
Thank you very much. I just have a couple of comments. One is we normally take care of pet situation in an MOU with the location before we go in. And if they tell us that they cannot or will not allow any animals, like if it's a mosque or a Latter-day Saint church, then we will not create an MOU with them, so we don't use their facility for that purpose. And the casino that you're talking about was actually, they are on a reservation or a Native American land, and they have their own laws, and I don't think ADA applies to them. I'm not sure, but that was one of the things that they brought up. So that was the reason. But we tried to take care of the problem ahead of time by knowing that the location is available for pets or for service animals.
Right. And Native American tribes, it's kind of complex under the ADA, because generally you are correct, and they are correct, that generally the ADA does not apply to Native American tribes. And this is also the same with religious entities. Generally, the ADA does not apply to religious entities. But the minute that they open themselves up to becoming a public accommodation, which is what a shelter becomes, is a public accommodation. So the minute they sign an MOU saying they will be a shelter, they have opened themselves up as a public accommodation. And this is true for a casino generally. It's opening itself up to the public to come in, unless they only allow tribal members in the casino, which would surprise me. And then they're open to the public, and they are a public accommodation, and they are covered by ADA, even if the rest of the tribe, the tribal government, the employment of the tribe, things like that are not covered by the ADA. But the casino is open to the public, and as soon as the church or mosque opens itself up as a shelter, they're open to the public as well, and they are now covered by the ADA.